Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership Podcast. Here to help you thrive as a follower of Jesus wherever you are and in whatever you're going through. Today, I am super excited to be joined by a good friend of mine, Chris Ashurst. Chris, along with his wife, Jill, have been in a New Frontiers church even before it was a New Frontiers church on the sunny south coast of England in a town called Seaford. Chris and Jill were part of the church with Terry Virgo in the early days and lived in Seaford as a married couple from 1971 until just a few years ago in 2018. So that's 47 years in Seaford, building the church, advancing the kingdom and serving the purposes of God. And then in 2018 moved from there to Bonnie, Scotland, to Edinburgh to be involved in the church there. And since then, God has taken you and Jill on quite a journey, I believe. And seeing you on BBC Scotland News kind of piqued my interest to make me think we should really have a conversation, Chris, to find out what God's done in your life recently and to find out what he's using you in to influence the powers that be and the higher authorities in the land. So Chris, but I should also say, you are one of the most inspiring men I know who have played a huge role in mentoring myself. So our listeners can blame you for a lot of my noisiness and opinions. But Chris, welcome to the New Ground Podcast. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jez.
Chris, why don't you just give us an indication of what you're up to in Scotland and why it was that you came to appear on BBC Scotland News?
Well, appearing on BBC Scotland News and even doing what I'm doing and we're doing at the moment is as much of a surprise to me as it is to everyone else. We're living in a wonderful part of Edinburgh. We have a flat. We live on the 4th floor. We'd never lived in a flat before. We'd always lived in a house. And we moved here, as we said, in 2018. We have a balcony, and I've just had my lunch sitting on the balcony looking out over the Royal Yacht Britannia.
Oh, check it out.
It is a beautiful place. Having said that, we live in a high-rise flat, and there are problems with high-rise flats across the United Kingdom, and indeed further than that, across the world. Many will have heard of the dreadful disaster at Grenfell and the deaths and the injuries and just a horrible thing that happened in that disaster. And that was attributable to some of the materials that were used in the construction of the buildings. So we live in our development where there's 279 flats and they go up quite high. And the people here obviously became concerned about, well, is our flat safe? Is it all right? And I had been invited to join the committee of our owners association. It's a strange world for an Englishman to be in because the law in Scotland is entirely different. It's particularly to do with how property is held. But at that committee, we felt we were obliged and we had to try and find out, well, is our building safe? We want people to feel safe. And we undertook quite a lot of research and we were trying to work out what the score was and how it could be dealt with. And we came to the conclusion initially that actually the materials in our flat were really pretty safe. We've had to moderate that a little bit lately. But as part of the process of trying to find out what the problem was, we were all scratching our heads. We were all laymen. We were just owners. And we tried to find out what we should be looking for. And we had hours and hours of research. And at one of our meetings back in, I guess it was April, no, it was probably May 2019, 2020 it was. And this is ridiculous. There are some other lovely developments on either side of ours, almost the same as ours, but built by different builders. And if we're sitting here trying to work out what our problem is, presumably there are people in that building and the other building trying to work out what the problem is. In fact, there's probably people all across Scotland trying to work out what the problem is and how it can be dealt with. And this was really kind of laying on me in quite a, not a heavy way, but I was really concerned, and I had the responsibility for investigating it here. And so we said, come on, let's see if we can cooperate with other people. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. If we can share information that we have with others to try and help them resolve their problem, and they with us, we may cut down the time to get to an end result. And as I began to research it more and more, I found that there were people living in flats in Scotland that were indeed built with the dangerous cladding, and there were people living in flats in Glasgow who were basically surrounded by highly flammable material, and people were the mental health issues that were flowing from that were enormous. There was a survey undertaken which showed that people living in these flats had a huge percentage who had suicidal thoughts, who couldn't sleep, who were suffering mental health problems. There were people living in the flats who had their bags packed by the front door to leave in case it caught fire during the night. And just that people couldn't move house. They couldn't go to a new job and getting new property where they were going to live. So we had a GP living here who was going to move, within Scotland, but outside of Edinburgh, and they needed to move, but they couldn't sell their flat because the banks had become alert to this, and they weren't going to lend on properties unless they had some sort of certification to prove that it was a good lending proposition. So basically the flat market ceased to exist. That may be slightly an overstatement, but for mortgage purposes, where there were high-rise flats, there were what were called nil values put on flats. So if I went to my estate agent and said, please you sell my flat, they say, well, have you got a certificate showing it's safe? Well, no, we haven't, because actually there's hardly anyone doing them, and we're not quite sure where that's going. Well, it's got a nil value, so we can't put it on the market. Now that has moderated since then, but that was the situation. So people's lives are on hold, people wanting to grow bigger families. So they wanted to move out of small flats into bigger flats, couldn't do it. So that people's lives were being totally affected across the board. And this was weighing on me quite a bit. And I was sitting in church on a Sunday morning, and a good friend of mine, Luke Evaditis, was preaching, and there's that wonderful account in Jeremiah 29, which is, everyone quotes Jeremiah 29 because they quote the bit about, I know the plans I have for you, plans for good, not for, but it was actually before that. And here are the people of God going into exile. Now, we didn't feel as an Englishman that we were in Scotland in exile, but as Christians, we're in a foreign land. And the warning to the people, or the encouragement actually to the people as they were going into exile, no, get home, settle down, get married, and pray for the welfare of the city. Seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare is your welfare. And this wonderful Old Testament passage really just spoke into my heart, and Luke was applying it and said, we're living in this world, we have to take action. And I made notes. I was just trying to find them just now. I couldn't lay my hands on them, but I made notes at the time because it was like I was pinned to the chair, because I was taking the position someone ought to do something about this. And I was sitting there that morning and just absolutely feeling from God, well, the someone is you. You've got to do something about it. And I didn't know where to start, didn't know anything. And I'm not used to doing that sort of thing. But I actually, because you know me, I make notes of all the things that are said during the preach and how to apply it. And I thought, I'm going to write that down, because one of the things was take action. So I wrote it down. And of course, when you do something like that, the next morning, I'm just getting up in the morning, I'm looking at my notes and reviewing yesterday, well, what did God say? And I hadn't forgotten, but there in my notes, take action. So I've got to do something about it. So I started that day doing something about it. So I spoke to some people in England who involved in a similar situation where the law is different and we can't do it the same way there, but they really encouraged us and me to take action and get involved and start something up. So we started a group which is called High Rise Scotland Action Group. I couldn't think of anything kind of more attractive in terms of name at the time. And so I immediately wrote to the Scottish Housing Minister, and I wrote to several people on one of at Holyrood in the Scottish Parliament, kind of the equivalent of the committees that they have at Westminster that review the actions of different departments, and wrote to several of the MSPs who were on that. And I got an immediate response. It appeared that they were having a meeting to discuss this very point and try and understand it. And I was called to give evidence 10 days later at Holyrood. So it was giving evidence largely by way of Zoom and so on. But that was quite an education. I'd never dealt with people like that before. And so I did. And out of that stemmed all sorts of things. I was pressing the housing minister here because I was determined that this was a really serious issue, but we were not going to take the stance of so many people who were really angry, and rightly angry and really upset, who would quite like to hang several politicians or bankers or builders from the highest yardarm they could find available and have chain themselves to the railings. And we set out an ethos statement, which was that we are not a protest movement. We are here to try and contribute with all the other parties involved, which include politicians, bankers, solicitors, surveyors, but to be part of the solution. And the stance the Scottish government was taking at the time was that they were trying to get to the best solution for the owners. And that was their objective. And this was stated, it was in the press, and it was in press releases and various statements that had been issued. And so I wrote to the housing minister and said, well, that's great. It's great that you've got this working group that she's working with you. The only point I would make is that you're trying to work for the interests of owners, but actually the owners aren't represented on this working group. So don't you think it would be a good idea? He didn't immediately respond, yes, Chris, I think that's a wonderful idea. He had worked really hard to try and get that group together. And of course, I have no experience in politics or dealing with politicians or any of these things. And I think he didn't know who I was from Adam. And, he didn't want to rock the boat because he had to work hard to get a group that were going to work together to try and get a result. So he didn't want some cowboy coming in and sort of setting off a machine gun around the place. And eventually I was asked if I go for half an hour of the first meeting. I kind of so that they could taste and see if I was good. And that went really well. And so everyone who was there apparently were unanimous in that we should be involved in the discussions and bring the owner's perspective, because you can have specialists, you can have fire specialists, you can have architects, you can have whatever. They come with their discipline and with their knowledge, which we need, but they don't actually come with the experience of living through it, and also of us as owners trying to understand what it is these guys are saying, because you can talk different languages. So then had a meeting at his request with the housing minister, who I got on with extremely well. Delighted to be working with him and his team. So over the next few months, we came up with the whole working group. There was a parliamentary or a minister's advisor group, which I was invited to join, which I did. And using some of the experience from our own development here and things that we tried to work out to try and get a resolution, when we brought that into the pot, the politicians and the civil servants kind of latched on to some of these things. I think we need to talk further. And so after Christmas this year, or last year now, I suppose 2020, that together with ideas brought from others were brought together, and we worked out a solution or a potential solution to try and establish what the size of the problem was. Because if the government, big if, to pay for the costs of putting everything right, they need to know how much it's going to cost. And there's hundreds of high-rise flats in Scotland. There are more in Glasgow than in Edinburgh. There are more in Edinburgh than in some of the other cities. But for anyone, politician or otherwise, to say, yes, we're going to put this right, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So, for example, there is one development in Glasgow, which is underway at the minute with what they call remediation, so taking off the old cladding, putting on new. And the cost of that is well north of £30 million. So it's a huge sum of money, and we're not talking, tuppence halfpenny. So then if you think of the number of properties across Scotland, not that they're all defective, but we don't know. And when research was undertaken into the records that were held in local authorities and so on as to how buildings had been built, they didn't tie up. So what was in some of the local government records, which was based on what are called building warrants, didn't tie up with what was actually put in the building. So the builders swapped things, or so they weren't the materials that were actually thought to be there. So the only way in which that can be sorted out is by someone going with knowledge, with competence, to inspect and actually get behind some of the cladding too, because they found that not only was the cladding in some cases suspect, when you look behind it, the fire breaks hadn't been put in. Other things which protect the safety of the people weren't in place, or they'd fixed them wrong. So that the possibility of a fire spread was exaggerated by these. So we came up with a plan, and it was called the Single Building Assessment. We launched that in March. Then we had an election in Scotland, so everything went quiet. And we are now at the implementation stage, which is going, I have to say, slightly more slowly than I wished. And there's now a governance board put in place by the government, which I've been invited to join part of, to try and work out how this is going to work on the ground. So the objective is that we want to give hope to people. And we've shared things with politicians and with civil servants who I have to say I'm very impressed with indeed. And we have our discussions, and sometimes I bring in an idea and they say, well, where did that idea come from? And I say to them, well, I call it one of my night thoughts. I said, but you need to understand that people are praying for us. The churches that I'm part of and other churches and Christians are praying for us that we get a resolution, because we want to give hope to people. And the big thing, we must hold out to people, because there is not a quick solution. What we write and what we settle on in our statements and our decisions isn't going to work overnight. It is going to take months, if not years, to get to a. And you've got people living, and it must give people hope. And so the civil servants, and I think the minister rather latched onto that. That apparently was relayed to the cabinet, the Scottish cabinet, and they touched on this thing of hope, which is really what we're. People are Christians or not, he's concerned.
Oh, sorry, you're cutting in and out a bit.
About the conditions they're living in. He's concerned about how they feel. He loves these people. He loves me. He loves you.
Chris, sorry, just jump in. You cut out a bit when you said something about so after you said it was the statement of hope, people have latched onto it, and then you've come on to talk about God's love for people. Could you just restart that sentence for me? That comment about because God loves people.
Yeah, the whole thing is that we wanted to convey, I don't just mean as Christians, but the government too, a message of hope. But from my point of view, and from God's point of view, he loves these people who are living in the flats. He cares about the lady who's sleeping in her flat with her bags packed by the front door. He cares about the people who can't sleep at night. He cares about the people who can't add to their families. And it's so important that people understand that our God is a God who loves these people and is concerned, and actually was concerned enough to speak to a guy called Jeremiah hundreds of years ago, calls him to write down what he said to his people then, calls a preacher in a church in Edinburgh to take that text at this time, preach from it. He cares enough that he applied it to my heart, and from that has come something that is out there to give hope to these people and show actually God is interested in the detail of your life. And you know, no one laughs. No one laughs when you say, actually, that was an idea and people have been praying and they go, oh, right, okay, you know.
Wow.
And so, yeah, have they all become Christian? Well, no, not yet.
Well, no, but I mean, that's almost not beside the point, but your opening statement of seeking the prosperity of the city. And I think that's, you know, you talk about the ways that God has orchestrated thus far. Well, you know, going further back than that, I know it's a way that you and Jill have lived this way for many years as followers of Christ who've tried to seek the prosperity, we say, of the city. But I mean, and actually what we mean is the individual men and women that you've come into contact with, the way that you live as someone who loves people and tries to express God's heart for them. Tell us a bit more about what you, because I think this is remarkable what God's doing in you and through you going to Scotland. And I'd love to just kind of get under the lid a little bit of and help our listeners understand how you came to Scotland, not necessarily all of the intricate prophetic words that led you there, but the way of life that you've pursued for, if I say decades, will that age you too much? But for decades, as a man of wisdom and experience with God, what are some of the principles that you've had in place for many years in the way that you've learned to seek God across the course of your life that led to you moving to Scotland, if that makes sense?
I think it has to be said, first of all, that I haven't always lived this way. Even as a professing Christian, I had sin and stuff in my life I had to deal with in a big way, even whilst going to church. But God is a God who's rich in mercy. And because he's shown mercy to me, I want to see him showing that mercy to other people. And yeah, it's right. Either I'm just a nosy person and I like to know about people, or God's put a love in my heart because he's interested in people. So when I meet people, I love to find out more about them and get to know them. And my ultimate would be to see them come to know the Lord. So we've tried to live in a way that lives that out, and been involved in the church both in Seaford and Eastbourne when we were living down that way. And the decisions that we made in life, particularly over the last 20 years or so, have been, well, what is it that God wants us to do? And we found that we were really thrilled with being involved in a great church and seeing many come to know the Lord and so on. Not particularly through me, it wasn't, but it was part of what the church was doing. And seeing lives turned around, it was absolutely thrilling. But of course, then people in church, whether they are paid or whether they are not, can get very involved in doing an awful lot. And we came to a stage where we were beginning to get older. I'd retired from work. I'd spent, I think, 10 years working at King's at Eastbourne. But hey, what are we doing? Where are we going? We're getting older. Maybe we need to downsize our house. All the questions that people in life face. But we wanted to make those decisions based on what God got in store. And people laugh at me because I don't believe that Christians retire. They may change what they do, but you can't retire. You can't retire from being a Christian. Being a Christian is because God's put his life in you and granted you forgiveness and brought you to himself and given you a relationship with him, a new life. And you can't retire from that. You don't retire from life, you die. And you don't retire from Christian life, neither do you die. You just move into another place, which will be even better than the flat I'm living in at the minute.
Without any cladding.
Without the cladding, absolutely. So that was in our minds. Our kids are grown up, left home, all that sort of stuff. They're living in the south of England. But we started thinking, no, we've really got to make wise decisions and ask God about what we should do. Shall we just move down the road, or shall we move to a smaller house in Seaford? We loved being part of the church in Seaford. We just loved it. But we just felt God saying, no, just take a break and just give it some space and let me speak to you, which he did.
Well, I think I'd love to hear the story in a second. I know how God spoke to you quite specifically about moving, but just pause there for a second in the story, because I'd love to just ask that question and tease out a bit more. How do you resist the trappings of an affluent society with all of its comfort and pleasures on offer to someone who is within their rights to just retire and relax and put their feet up, so to speak? How do you, and that can be very tempting, just spend the next 20 years working on your house, making it as pristine as you can, and not necessarily anything wrong with that, of course, but how do you resist those trappings as a Christian? How have you personally managed to do that?
Well, I think the driving thing is that God has called us to a relationship with him and what we want to do, and we don't always get it right. I'm not speaking from having a having arrived position, but what I want to do and what gives me joy and what gives Jill joy is when we please God. And what could be more pleasing to God than do what he wants? So we need to find out what he wants. And possessions and stuff aren't all they're cracked up to be. I was very fortunate in my career. I had a job where I was earning far more money than I ever ought to have done. The huge sums. I thought they were huge anyway, but it didn't count for much, because what satisfies is satisfying God and knowing that you're pleasing God and seeing fruit from his life working out through you. So that drove us, really not terribly interested in kind of big houses. The flat we're in, I'm amazed we're in. We saw a picture of it when we were on the train, actually traveling up to Edinburgh when we were house hunting, and I looked at it, it actually flashed up on my computer. It was on the desk on the train. There's this picture of this amazing flat, and it's got this ensuite, and it's got this kind of wardrobe area, it's got this, that, and the other. Wow, look at that, goodness gracious, we'd never live in a place like that, and here we are. So I was just amazed, but it doesn't do it for me. What does it is knowing that God's got our hearts, and so that's what is pleasing. And yeah, are there other temptations? You Jez, you know me. I love taking photographs. I love doing this, that, and the other. I'll go and, if I'm not careful, I'll go and buy a new camera at the drop of a hat and all this sort of stuff. But no, I have to try and limit that. So what does God want here? And so I need to give my resources and my life to what God's got in store. And many years ago, a guy actually from a New Frontiers church in South Africa spoke into Jill and my life. Actually, it was after a meeting over in Canada, and he spoke about how you've got to finish the race, you've got to run to the winning tape, and that's our ambition, to run to the winning tape.
That's beautiful.
So when God puts a call on your life or gives you a gift, he doesn't withdraw it at age 65. He doesn't say, it's in my agreement with you that when you get to 65, you go off and do something else. Why would you want to do that? When you serve God, until your dying day, if God gives us health and strength, then that's wonderful. So, I see that modeled around me. I see that modeled in New Frontiers. I see that in people like Terry Virgo. Has he retired? Well, it didn't seem so from what I was seeing on Facebook last week. Yeah, he keeps going. Did Billy Graham retire? Oh, I don't think so. He kept writing books. He kept doing stuff.
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges, and I was talking only this morning to someone in the church who's just retired and is now from work, paid work, and is now really wrestling with his personal sense of vocation identity, because he's no longer got a paid job. What he was using his skills for before, he's not using them for anymore. And he's walking a bit through a wilderness of trying to work out, well, who am I and what do I do now? And what I find fascinating about yours and encouraging about your story is, so you were an insolvency practitioner professionally. Sorry to out you. But in the time that I've known you, you've taught English as a foreign language to immigrants in Eastbourne. And now you're in Scotland on a housing kind of building regulations committee. Neither of those two roles in the community were you trained in any aspect, but certainly you became an English teacher and you trained yourself. You came to Ukraine on mission, and we taught some teachers, or you taught some teachers out there to teach English. Can you just speak to that person, though, who's just retired and is kind of sitting around wondering, with a sense of personal crisis, how do I find the will of God for my life now? What are some things that you've got in place that have helped keep you in a position where you're able to hear from God and believing that God's going to use you?
I think the first thing to realize is,
I'll say that it cut off. Sorry, say that again. Say the sentence. I think the first thing to realize is, because you cut out.
I think the first thing to realize is that we are not called by God to do, we are called by God to be. And a good friend of mine, who in fact was pastor at the church in Seaford before Terry even came to the church in Seaford, I was at his, I think, 70th birthday bash, however many years ago that was, and the word retirement came into the conversation, and he was saying, well, I don't really get this retirement word. And a mutual friend of ours had said to him, Phil, you can't retire from what you are. It's what you are. You never stop being you. And if God has put stuff in you, then you must allow that to work out in the best possible way. Now, it may have worked out in a professional career that you were doing a lot of things. But if your reliance, of course, was on that for your identity, then that can become a problem. So when there's a change of life, you have to go back to be fairly ruthless and say, well, what is it that God has called me to do? What's he gifted me in? How has he made me? Now, as I said before, either I'm nosy or I just like people, but I can't stop talking to people. So, if I'm at a bus stop, I'll strike up a conversation within, seconds. And I've got a little card that I give to people if the conversation goes in a particular way, which is a very gentle little thing about introducing them to myself, that they can look up later. There's no pressure on them. I just love meeting people, whether they're, I met Stradley in Edinburgh, in Leith and so on. We have quite a few drug addicts and people around, and people with all sorts of issues. They're great, get on well with them. I don't know hundreds of them, but if I meet them, we get on. But then, strange, of course, also in Edinburgh, we have 4 or 5 universities. So it's and I just love meeting people. So God has given me something of his heart for people, whether it's teachers in Ukraine, illegal immigrants in Eastbourne, people just wanting to learn the language, whether it's people living in houses. There's something of God's heart which has spilled over that has to work out. So if you're going through a change in life, you have to be slightly radical and take time probably, and counsel with friends, and particularly counsel with God. God, what do I do in this new season? What have you made me for? What have you made me for? So if you've got a prophetic gift, then maybe you just really need to be culturing that and talking with the leaders in the church where you are. How do you see that working out? Do you actually think I have got a prophetic gift? Or am I kidding myself? Let's have some serious talks here. And part of our move here was that we was a super guy from what is now Emmanuel Church in Eastbourne, or Mosaic Church in Berlin. And he said, you've got to be ruthless with yourself, because you don't want to waste the years that are ahead of you. You don't want to waste them. God's given you these, so use them for his glory. But you might need to take time to do it properly, to find out, well, what are the things that really God's called me to, and actually really make me work and really make me play my part in the body of Christ. We come back to the 1 Corinthians passage, don't we, about, everyone plays their part. They've got different gifts. So what's your gift? How are you going to let that gift of God work out? Or are you going to just waste it and put it on the side? Maybe it hasn't been developed enough. Okay, you're 60, 65. Nothing to stop you developing it now. Go for it. But you need to know what's God saying to you. Not get involved in flights of fancy. Do it with the counsel of, your leaders in your church and good friends around you. We did that ourselves, and we also took time to speak with other people who weren't Christians, who loved us and cared for us, their views, and our family, our kids, and talk it through with them. So there were no misunderstandings along the way. And so my son, who's not actually walking with God at the moment, but he rang me the other day and he said, Dad, I'm concerned about you. What are you doing about this? So he will speak direct to me. So I need to hear that. So
and Chris, there's something that I've always just admired and loved about you, is you have such a soft heart and are so teachable. How have you cultivated that? Is that intentional, or is that just your predisposition? You're naturally open, someone as wise and as competent as you are, and I don't say that to flatter you, I mean that, but yeah, I think you remain open, believing that anyone, regardless of their status or how well they might know you or not know you, anyone could speak into your life. You seem to have remained soft-hearted to that. How have you managed to do that?
Well, I don't know, I've remained soft-hearted, I think, through my own experience and my own sin, really, that I found that I'm an only child, so I didn't have brothers or sisters. I have some really good friends who I could rephrase this, you might have to edit this, who are girls, but they kind of adopted me as a sister, brother, and would speak into it. And they would actually speak very directly to me, very directly. But I was essentially an only child, and I was brought up in a society where people very much get themselves, especially, from a certain background. And my father died when I was 14. It was a difficult time, to put it mildly. And so I became quite protective, didn't share things, was quite deceitful in all my ways. So God had to deal with that. But having dealt with it, what a joy to know that you can open yourself up to others and allow them to speak. And it's safety, isn't it? Why wouldn't you? So not only that, and it's not only safety, it helps you develop. I mean, one of the politicians that I'm speaking with and have become very friendly. Well, no, he's not. I'm not very friendly with him, but I have become a friend. He adopts an entirely different lifestyle from mine, and he knows I don't go along with that. He has a gay lifestyle, which isn't what I would adopt, but we have a respect for one another, and I've learned from him, and I've seen him working, and he's currently working in a different sphere because he's now doing something else within politics, but he's so caring. am I saying that's fine, that's everything's all right? No, I'm not. He knows that. But we can learn from people like that. And, you know, so let's be learning. So if you're 60, 65, don't give up. Don't go off to Barbados, sit on the beach and waste your life.
But I know, I mean, you wouldn't, in saying that, I can hear what you're saying, of course, in the Barbados comment, but I also know you like to enjoy traveling. You have your camper van, you go around the country. So it's not a question of denying everything in the world. Well, actually, I think the two things are linked in what I've just said then and your comment about your politician friend. I think in the church, we have this concept from Augustine of common grace and understanding that God's general goodness is at work in the world. And I think in the church, we can define that too narrowly, that it's basically about, oh, you know, we're alive and we're moral, and that's God, and we've all got a natural gift, and that's God's common grace to us. Whereas actually, I think common grace is a lot more expansive and a lot broader than we realize, that there is goodness in the world. And actually, as God's sons and daughters, we get to enjoy and experience all of God's gifts that he's given us as an act of worship to him. I mean, you've been in church, as we mentioned, in New Frontiers churches for a long time. What would be some of your advice to people in churches sitting under pastors, some of whom, particularly given the age demographic that we're perhaps talking to in this podcast, some of those pastors may be several decades younger than the individuals are in the church, and I can imagine it must be hard for people of an age to receive and listen to young men and women who are several decades younger than them, with a lot less life experience and wisdom. And yet again, you've someone who listened to me preach, let's put it that way, courteously, and was encouraging, and have you know, and are willing to hear God speaking, whoever the messenger is. So I guess my question is, after all of that, my question is, what advice would you give to people going through different church experiences? How do they stay involved and passionate about the mission of the local church without becoming jaded and cynical? That's my question.
Well, I think you become jaded and cynical probably when either you're going wrong or something else is going wrong. God places us in families, and he places us in church. The Christian life was never meant to be lived in isolation. And as you know, Jez, of course, you have, you know, you've got your mum and you've got your in-laws and you've got your kids. So it's a family, and that's how it is. And in church, we are family, and we need old and young, experienced and inexperienced. And sometimes the inexperienced old git or the experienced old gits sit back and say, well, they didn't do it like that when I was younger. 20 years ago, we did it like this and it worked all right then. Hey, life changes. God's life doesn't change, but he adapts not his message, but the way in which it is delivered and conveyed through our lives to the people that we're living among. And we need to not be proud. We don't need to be proud and say it wasn't like that, or I don't. And sometimes I've been in situations in my own church here where all of the elders are younger than I am, and occasionally they'll say something, and I think, really, I'm not sure about that. My first port of call when that happens is, actually, maybe I might be wrong. Am I coming at this from the wrong angle? Have I got this wrong? Have I been living for 40, 50, 60, 70 years with that understanding, and actually I've led myself up the garden path? I've got it wrong. So I need to check that out. And then, having gone to God and talked to him about it, if I still feel that, then I'll get in touch directly as a friend with the elder or the leader. I didn't quite understand it. Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, which is very easy for me to do. Or, what do you think about this? And we've had some really good conversations. And sometimes it's, oh, me saying, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. And sometimes it's them saying, oh yeah, I see, I hadn't kind of thought of that. Yeah, thank you. And we work it out. So we don't throw our toys out the pram and kind of have a little paddy, or, you know, if we don't agree with the preacher on the Sunday morning, have him for lunch, as it were, carve him up over the joint. We actually deal with it properly. And that's scriptural. That is the way it should be. And that's the way it should be in church. That's the way it should be in family. So we need to be humble and remain humble and be open to correction, whether we're 10 or 110. I'm not sure I'll make 110, but hey. So we need to be humble and play our part. And we also need to realize that because we did something a certain way those years ago, and maybe we did it well, that doesn't mean to say we need to do it now. You know, as I get older, there are things that I can't do. You know, I can still run for a bus. If I really have to, I can still run for a bus. But there are other things that I can't do, and shouldn't. So we need to adapt some of the things that we do, and the way we think about it. You hear people, not particularly in church, all over the place saying, oh, I don't feel any older than I did when I was a teenager, or I feel like a teenager. Well, you're not. So get used to it. It's part of God's plan for you to grow old, and to deal with it well, and to do what you can do. Now, I mean, a case in point, if you think of Billy Graham through his life, he was saying crusades all over the world. He was traveling, he was doing this, that, and the other. As he got older, he couldn't do all of that. But he didn't give up. He didn't change his message, but what he did changed. But it didn't stop him being who he was. He was an evangelist through and through. He never stopped being an evangelist. He carried out his ministry to the end. It's just the way in which he did it changed along the way. And so it should be, I happen to use Billy Graham as an illustration, but I think he's a wonderful example. So for us, we need to change the things we do. You know, we had 2 meetings yesterday, one in the morning and one in the evening. I have to say, I had having a little snooze in the afternoon. Yeah, things change, but actually, you want to be at your best, don't you? When you go to a meeting in the evening, and you're going to meet with God, God's going to meet with his people. You want to be alert. You don't want to be falling asleep. So how you do things and what you do may change. What you are does not.
That's really helpful. I love the childlike wonder with which you still approach church, even because you realize when you go to a meeting on a Sunday, you're going to meet with God. That seems to still grab you as something that's worthy of getting excited about. What rhythms or things practically do you have in your life that have helped keep that aspect of your life soft and excited to God? Do you see what I mean? It's a strange way of putting the question.
Well, I would like to say I'm a great man of prayer, and I read the Bible from one end to the other in a year. I'm not a great man of prayer. I struggle with praying, but I pray, and I try and have a regime. Actually, that is the wrong word, regime, a life, where in the mornings, before I do anything else, I will try and, well, Jill and I always read some Psalms or a Psalm, and together in the morning, we find that God will often have something in that Psalm that speaks into each of our lives. And that may very well trigger me off. I'm not great in the mornings. I can be morning grumpy.
I can vouch for that.
I kind of I need to kind of have a bit of space to work out who I am and look up in my books and see what my name is, and I kind of just need that space. And other people are the other end of the day people. But I find that if I go into our living room and don't sit looking out of the window at the hills and the Royal Yacht and the sea and the whatever, but actually sit down with the Bible, and I use a paper Bible. I do use computers and I research things on computers, but I find computers can distract me. So if I've got a computer open, there's a screen there, you can have something flash up or whatever, and I can find that distracting. So personally, I I use a paper Bible, and I will sit there and I'll pick up on some of the things that God's been saying. Well, I'm working through a particular passage day in, day out, and try and trace it through. So sometimes that can be half an hour, sometimes it could be 2 or 3 hours. And I just find that God speaks to me and keeps me soft. And sometimes, so this Wednesday, I have a government board meeting thingy. But I shall make sure that I've spent some time with God before that. Otherwise, you wake up in the morning and think, oh, I've got to do this today. So all your thoughts are onto that. So if you get first things first, I find that's really helpful. And I don't find it difficult to be thrilled with the church. I think the church is God's wonderful, wonderful creation. It's his body on the earth. You know, Jesus isn't on the earth now in that sense of the man Jesus who was born of the Virgin Mary. But Jesus is on the earth today. He has a body, and it's his church. It's you and me, and the other people in my church, and the other people in the other churches across Edinburgh, the other churches across Scotland, the other churches across the UK. We are the body of Christ. And so God is still at work through his Son in the body today. And the body, it says, builds itself up. And we can add and bless one another by listening to one another. I was at a meeting yesterday morning, and there was a tongue brought by one of our young people. I should guess she's just into her 20s. Lovely young lady. And I was sitting, we have an old Victorian building, so I was actually up in the balcony yesterday, and I thought, well, I haven't got the interpretation. I wonder who's going to bring it. And I thought, oh, I guess it might be so-and-so. And this guy who, again, in his 20s, came and brought most wonderful sung interpretation. And I was chatting to him afterwards. He had never brought an interpretation before. Wow. Never. And it was powerful. And God was in it. And you see, and it blessed my heart. And it pointed me to God. And it made me thrilled with God about how worthy he is. And that was part of the song that came out, and the way in which it was sung. And I'm thinking, hey, that guy's really blessed me. You know, this is the body working. Here's this guy in his 20s. He's moved up here to get married, become part of the church, and he's blessing all these people in the church. Isn't it great when that happens? I think it's wonderful. So when you see it work, it's great. When it goes wrong, okay. You pick yourself up, dust yourself down, say, well, that wasn't very good, was it? Let's press on. We don't have a witch hunt. We say, oh, what can we learn from that? How do we resolve that? But on the whole, isn't it just wonderful? And that is God's answer for this world.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you, Chris. Let's finish the story that I put a pause on or a pin in all those conversational topics ago when we were talking about how God spoke to you to move to Edinburgh. I know it resulted in you writing a book that you give out to people. You still give out to people, even in Edinburgh. You were telling me the other day, people ask a booklet called "Why on Earth Would You Do That?" I believe.
Crazy.
What you're doing is crazy. There it is. So you give that out as an
credits are to Don Smith.
Okay,
that was his phrase. He said, but the rest of it is, what you're doing is crazy, but God is in it.
But God is in it. Fantastic. So tell us, how did you know God was in it, causing you to move from your home of 47 years, or your town, the town that you lived in for 47 years, to a new country and start afresh? I mean, by all accounts, it seems that God's using you, as we've talked about in Edinburgh, which is thrilling. But what was it that helped you make that decision for yourself?
Well, I mean, it was a surprise. I certainly, for the most of my life, never thought I would be living in another country. But actually, from a child, was always aware that God moved people to where he wanted them to. I was fortunate I was born into a wonderful family, and they're part of a great Baptist church in South London, in Purley, which saw remarkable growth and conversions in the 1950s. My dad was heavily involved in that. So I was brought up in a setting where people from that church, young people, as they left, well, actually in the 50s, of course, they left school and did their national service in the army. But after that, or university, they were going all over the world. And that was the norm, that God has a big view of this world and he wants to see people saved. So even when I wasn't walking with God, I always had it in the back of my mind that God could place me where he wanted me. And I remember when I left school, I went for my interviews, and I went to an interview with Lloyd's Bank and in Terminus Road in Eastbourne, and was offered a job. And one of the things you had to sign, I wasn't walking with God, but one of the things I had to sign was that I would be willing to go where the bank wanted me to go. And I thought, I can't sign that because I don't know what God wants, which was a fairly strange thought for someone who wasn't really walking with God. So that has always been in the back of my mind. So when I guess I was working with Jez and I was ill. I wasn't ill because I was working with Jez. I just probably need to make that very clear. But I was ill. I was off for, I think, 5 or 6 weeks, and I couldn't speak. And Jez will testify to that. He probably thought that was a real blessing. Probably my wife did too. I just lost my voice. But it makes you question, what am I doing? And the answer to that was, I was doing a lot. And I enjoyed it. And wonderfully, God's given me ability to do all sorts of strange things and do them to a reasonable level. So if someone says, would you like to do that? I think, oh, yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah, I could do that. I'd enjoy doing that. So over a period of time, as we referred to earlier, really, in church life, you can get involved in all sorts of things. And probably some of them you shouldn't be involved in, actually. Because actually you're taking someone else's place, just by the by, because you're not allowing them to develop into what God's calling them to. So anyway, I was ill, and it raises questions. Okay, do I just carry on doing what I'm doing? You know, what do we do about this? And began to feel that God was saying, no, you need to take a sabbatical. You need to actually take time to listen to me and find out what I want for you for this next season of your life. So we did. We took a sabbatical. We took our camper van and we spent, I think, the first 4 or 5 weeks going around part of the UK and really enjoying it, enjoying the scenery, enjoying just exploring different places. And it was great. We visited the odd church. I don't mean that the churches were odd. I mean, we went to 1 or 2 churches. And then in our 6-month sabbatical, we actually did visit quite a few churches. And some of them were odd, actually, in the other meaning of the word, because we wanted to learn. We went to cathedrals, we went to Anglican, we went to New Frontiers, we went to small groups, we went to, because we wanted to learn and see what we could pick up from other people. And all the time we say, God, we want to learn, but are you speaking to us? And during that time, we had made a list. I talked about not going on the beach in Barbados. Well, when we decided we got to move, we did actually make a list. We made a fantasy list. We said, let's not be too serious about this. Just put down anything that comes into our minds, just in case God's in it, and or for a bit of fun. So where might we go? These are our thinkings. Okay. Actually, we have been to Barbados. We like Barbados. It's nice. So the Caribbean, hey, God, it would be great to be called to the Caribbean. Actually, I'm glad we're not in the Caribbean. So we made a list. It included places like Cornwall, Scotland, which we liked, and a host of other places. including Newhaven, which is just along the road from Seaford by about 3 miles. And one day, Jill was looking in, I don't know, it's the Friday ad. It was one of these things. No, it was online as to, you know, properties in Newhaven. And she typed in Newhaven. And the very first thing that came up was some properties in Newhaven, which isn't surprising. But what was surprising was that the Newhaven was actually in Edinburgh, Scotland, not in East Sussex. And we were somewhat taken aback, and it was a bit of a joke, but we kind of lodged it away. And actually, our flat, we are in Edinburgh, we are in Leith, but we're actually specifically in Newhaven. But we didn't put a huge weight on that. It was a kind of, oh, it's one of those funny things that happens. And so we worked through until we, in our minds, there were several options. We found God speaking to us in virtually all of the churches that we went to, odd or not. So when we were at Anglican Cathedral, and someone would speak, there would be something for us. We were at a small group, there'd be something that speak to us. We went to, you know, churches in the north of England. God spoke to us. We had people who we had never met in our lives came up to us in churches with prophetic words. And so we began to weigh this up. There were several options. We were asked to consider the possibility of going to Berlin, which was not on our list. And when someone said that to me or to us, my initial thought was, I don't like Berlin, and I don't want to die in Berlin. Strange thought, but hey. But also, we felt we needed to be hearing what God was saying. So we didn't just dismiss it. We said, no, we've got to at least consider this. And, you know, is God maybe saying, go to Berlin? Obviously, people think it would be helpful. Now, actually, through that, it firmed up our decision to come here, not because we didn't want to go to Berlin, but because the people involved there spoke to us so strongly and so well and so pastorally about how we should conduct ourselves in finding out what God wants. It was really helpful. So all these things came together. So we ended up with a kind of list. And we had a place in Norfolk, and lovely, actually, New Frontiers Church in Norfolk we visited, and they would really like us, she would really have liked us to have gone there. There was a possibility there. We visited here in Scotland, and we had met with some of the elders from here some while before at New Ground prayer days and things and conferences. So there was a range of places, or stay in Seaford, or go to Eastbourne, and there were various kind of plans and things, and but they weren't really working out very fast. And we were saying, God, we want to know. We really want to know. And it wasn't that we were off the church at Seaford. We certainly weren't. We loved the church at Seaford and still do, as we have all our lives, and well, all the time it's been going. But during our sabbatical, we deliberately didn't go there other than 2 or 3 times. And we got to the point where, you know, should we really move or shouldn't we? This is dragging out God. Have we got this wrong? Where are we going? Anyway, it narrowed down to a few options, really. And in our hearts, I think we thought, no, it's probably Scotland, probably is the church at Edinburgh, who wanted older people, and we qualified. So one Sunday morning in particular, we were putting out the chairs as we used to at the church in Seaford, because we were in a school hall then, and there's a guy there who super guy in the church. Hi, Ross. And he just said, hey, every time I see you this morning, every time you walk into my view or whatever, I just have one word that's coming into my head. And I go, oh. He said, do you want me to tell you what it is? I did think of saying, no, of course not, not interested. And he said, it's Edinburgh. I went, what? So having been, as you've already referred to, an insolvency practitioner, so you question everything. You know, what do people know? So I then got into that mode. Okay, Ross, what do you know? And he said, I don't know anything. He said, I said, well, you know, we went there. He said, well, I knew you'd been on holiday to Scotland, been to Edinburgh. I didn't, and that was months ago. I didn't know anything other than that. But it's just, that was the word.
Wow.
And so things really got crystal clear. There was scriptures, there were preaches. I have notes upon notes of days, times when God spoke to us. You can look back, you can go to those people, and you, Jez, are one of those people, because on a particular Sunday morning, bearing in mind that Jez and I have been good friends for quite a few years and worked together, he wasn't expecting us, and we did turn up on the sabbatical. And I don't know whether you recall, but Jez normally greets people extremely warmly, and it wasn't that he was off with me that day, but it was a little stilted. And then he got to preach, and he was preaching about Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees. And when he explained to me later that he felt he got a word for the church, that was in his mind as to how he's bringing it, and I'm sure it was. And he said, actually, sometimes when God speaks to you about you've got to go, you've got to go. And sometimes that actually means you've got to go, as in move. And it was like, goodness gracious. Now, I think Jez was reluctant to consider the possibility of us moving away, but he wasn't reluctant because he wanted God's best for us and made that very clear all the way along.
Didn't greet you very warmly then, apparently, because I thought you might interpret what I was going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. You were thinking, I know what.
Oh, great, he's here. That means the Lord's going to tell him to leave.
And so afterwards, he said to me, Jez, you said, so what did you think of that? And I think I said to you, no, what did you think of that? And so, yeah, it was very, very clear that we should come here. And we've been so thrilled to be part of this great church up here in Edinburgh. And the churches that are around. There's some brilliant churches in Edinburgh. God's doing some remarkable stuff. There's some challenges and difficulties that everyone faces along the way, and there's been some big things going on, but there have been so many encouragements. And to find myself involved in sitting in meetings with government officials and ministers and cabinet secretaries and whatever is just, I find it bizarre. I was saying to Jez just the other day, it's how it unfolds is just so strange. The wonderful question living here, people obviously know I'm not from Edinburgh, strangely, I just don't have the accent. And they say, oh, what brought you here? My goodness, what a wonderful question. And if they're silly enough to ask it, I'm silly enough to answer it. And often we'll give them a book or something, and people are like, wow, so God speaks today. You think God's, and they see what's going on. And in a sense, what God has done has validated the fact, not that he's spoken to me, but that he speaks to people. God is concerned for the man and woman living in the flat, the man at the bus stop. He actually has an interest in people, and he will speak to them to change their lives. God is not irrelevant. So it's given us wonderful opportunities. And I find myself sometimes even sitting in government meetings, and it's like watching a video, like sitting there watching the television, and you see it all happening before you, and you hear yourself saying things and you think, gosh, how is all this happening? This is interesting. How did that? And there's no strain in it. And I find it scary. I find it a responsibility. I find it sometimes that when a government minister says to you, okay, well, we're bringing our recommendation to Holyrood, we're bringing our press release to the Scottish people about this plan, we need to have some statements about it. And we're sitting in the meeting with people, highly qualified, whatever. And so I'd like some, some statements from you to go in the press release. And then, so someone who I esteem greatly and is in a particular industry and has knowledge of it said, okay, well, before we get too involved in that, we instruct our PR department to help us write all this for the press release. We don't all, 11 of us or whatever it is, however many there were, we don't all want to spend hours and hours on this. Is there a kind of pecking order as to who you want to say something? To which the minister said something along the lines of, yeah, I'd like several people to say something, but I must have something from Chris Ashurst. So I'm thinking, really? Wow. And actually that kind of weighs in on you, really, and the weight that people put on your words, because it's so easy, and it's easy for me to speak quite glibly, and I just find I really have to consider what I'm saying. I think God's still teaching me. In fact, this whole process with seeing how the civil servants have been working together as a brilliant team, actually, taught me things. And I'm in the 70s, so I'm learning. I just find it incredible that this bloke from Seaford is sitting in this situation, and God is hopefully using it to bring hope to people.
Wow. Beautiful, Chris. I think that's as good a place as any we could hope for to end our conversation, our time together. Such an inspiring moment in your life, and to see what God's done in you across your life. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us and to share your heart. We really look forward to hearing about what God's done as a result of all these meetings, and we're praying that you manage to wield your prayer power to release the Scottish government to spend millions and millions of pounds, or whoever needs to spend the millions and millions of pounds to bring hope and security to people in those high-rise flats. So God bless you, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, James. It's been a privilege.